The chandeliers burned like captive constellations above the polished floor of Wycliffe House, their crystal throats trembling with candlelight, casting gold across silk and ambition alike. London's most discerning families had gathered beneath that glittering canopy, perfumed and powdered, armed not with swords, but with glances sharpened to a lethal gleam. The orchestra coaxed a waltz from its strings, smooth as poured honey, and the dancers revolved in obedient splendor, skirts blooming and folding like disciplined flowers. It was a night designed for triumphs, for alliances sealed in lace, and fortunes promised in murmured vows. Yet near the far colonnade, half-shadowed by a towering arrangement of winter roses, stood a young woman who had been granted no such victory. Miss Eliza Whitcombe held herself with deliberate composure, though composure was the only garment she possessed in abundance. Her gown, ivory and modestly trimmed, bore neither ostentatious jewels nor extravagant embroidery. It relied instead upon fine tailoring and the quiet dignity of its wearer. A single pearl rested at her throat, luminous but unassuming. She might have been mistaken for serene, had one not noticed the faint tension gathered at her clasped hands. Across the ballroom, laughter burst like a cork freed from pressure. The sound came from Mr. Charles Hargrove, who had once knelt before Eliza in a rain-drenched garden and sworn her eternal devotion. He now whirled Lady Margaret Ainsley across the floor, his posture inflated with triumph. Lady Margaret glittered with diamonds that captured every wandering beam of light, her smile sharpened by satisfaction. Their movements were deliberately exuberant, designed not merely to impress but to wound. Whispers circled Eliza as surely as the dancers circled the room. She was quite certain of the match, one matron observed behind her fan. "A most unfortunate miscalculation," replied another, eyes glinting. The engagement had dissolved only weeks before, under circumstances polite society described as mutual understanding. The truth, however, possessed a harsher edge. Charles had discovered that Lady Margaret's dowry exceeded Eliza's modest inheritance by a figure too persuasive to ignore. Love, it seemed, had bowed before arithmetic. Eliza had endured the formal announcement with restrained grace, offering no tears to nourish gossip. But tonight, abandoned against the wall, while her former betrothed flaunted his new allegiance, she felt humiliation settle like frost upon her skin. No gentleman had approached her. Invitations drifted elsewhere, carried by calculation rather than kindness. The orchestra shifted into a brighter measure. Charles laughed again, too loudly, and allowed his gaze to flicker toward Eliza. It lingered just long enough to register her solitude. His smile deepened, satisfied. Something within her chest tightened, not heartbreak, for that had already been endured in private, but indignation. She would not be reduced to spectacle. She would not permit him the pleasure of witnessing her isolation. A new set was called. Gentlemen bowed, ladies curtsied. The floor rearranged itself with seamless precision. Eliza inhaled slowly, gathering what fragments of pride remained. If society insisted upon performance, she would provide one of her own. Without granting herself time for reconsideration, she stepped away from the colonnade. The nearest gentleman stood slightly apart from the throng, tall and immaculately attired in black evening coat and waistcoat, so severe they appeared carved from shadow itself. His profile was sharply defined, his expression unreadable. Few approached him, though many observed from a careful distance. Eliza recognized him only vaguely, a name attached to rumors whispered more cautiously than others. Her pulse quickened. She had no strategy beyond necessity. "Sir," she began, her voice low enough to avoid surrounding ears, "I must beg a kindness." He turned then, fully, and his gaze settled upon her with unsettling steadiness. His eyes were a pale, piercing gray, the color of winter seas beneath overcast skies. For a moment, she nearly retreated, but Charles's laughter rang again. "Please," she murmured, forcing composure into each syllable, "just one dance. My former betrothed is watching." The words hung between them, fragile and perilous. She had revealed more than prudence allowed, yet desperation had eclipsed caution. A silence followed, not dismissive but measured. The gentleman removed one glove with deliberate precision, folding it once before tucking it into his palm. The movement was unhurried, almost ceremonial. "Madam," he replied at last, his tone deep and controlled, "you request intervention with admirable candor." Heat crept to her cheeks. "I require only a partner, sir." His gaze shifted briefly across the ballroom, assessing. It paused upon Charles and Lady Margaret, whose laughter faltered as they noticed the exchange. When the gentleman looked back at Eliza, something unreadable flickered in his expression. Calculation, perhaps, or resolve. "You understand," he said quietly, "that I do not engage lightly." She had no comprehension of his meaning, yet pride forbade retreat. "Nor do I, sir." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to contract around them. The orchestra swelled into the opening strains of the waltz, awaiting participants. Then he inclined his head. "As you wish." He extended his arm. Only as she placed her trembling fingers upon his sleeve did recognition strike with electric clarity. Duke Alistair Ravenscroft, England's most feared nobleman. The name alone carried a weight that silenced conversations and altered fortunes. It was said he dismantled rivals without raising his voice, that he possessed a mind sharper than any blade, that no scandal survived his scrutiny unscarred. Mothers steered daughters clear of his notice, uncertain whether his attention promised elevation or ruin. Gasps rippled outward as realization dawned among the guests. Charles's smile evaporated. Lady Margaret's fan stilled midair. The Duke led Eliza toward the center of the floor with a composure that bordered on intimidating serenity. The dancers nearest them withdrew instinctively, clearing space as though for royalty or reckoning. Eliza's heart thundered. She had sought a fleeting gesture of dignity, nothing more. Instead, she had summoned a storm. As the orchestra surged and the Duke's hand settled at her waist, firm yet impeccably restrained, he leaned just close enough for his voice to reach only her. "Miss Whitcombe," he murmured, "one dance is rarely without consequence." And beneath the blaze of chandeliers and the sharpened stare of society, the waltz began. The first turn of the waltz carried them into the center of the ballroom, as though the polished floor itself had yielded to his command. Conversation thinned to a brittle murmur. Fans paused mid-flutter. Even the violins seemed to draw their bows more carefully, as if aware that something irrevocable had entered the room. Eliza felt the Duke's gloved hand steady at her waist, neither possessive nor hesitant, but assured in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. His other hand enclosed hers with formal precision. He guided rather than pulled, and yet she had the unsettling impression that resistance would be futile. "You may still withdraw," he said quietly, his expression composed, his gaze fixed over her shoulder as decorum required. "And concede the spectacle," she returned, keeping her smile faint and untroubled. "I believe I have endured sufficient retreat for one evening." A subtle shift touched his mouth, almost approval. They turned again, skirts whispering against black wool. Eliza had always danced well. Her mother had insisted that grace was a woman's first armor. Yet tonight she felt less like an ornament and more like a standard lifted before an army. Every step seemed amplified by the attention converging upon them. Across the room, Charles stood rigid at the edge of the floor, his partner momentarily forgotten. His confidence had curdled into something sharper. The Duke did not glance at him again. That indifference, Eliza sensed, was more devastating than any direct challenge. "You appear remarkably untroubled, Your Grace," she ventured. "I am rarely troubled," he replied. "I prefer to trouble others." The words were delivered without heat, yet beneath them lay iron. She wondered, not for the first time, whether she had miscalculated the magnitude of her request. They completed another circuit. A matron leaned toward her companion, whispering with poorly disguised agitation. A cluster of debutantes stared openly. Eliza felt the weight of scrutiny pressing against her spine, yet the Duke's steady rhythm anchored her. "Why?" she asked softly, risking honesty. You owe me nothing." He did not answer immediately. Instead, he executed a flawless pivot, drawing her closer for a breath span before allowing distance again. "I dislike cruelty disguised as civility," he said at last. "It offends my sense of order." The simplicity of the explanation unsettled her more than elaborate motives would have done. The music swelled toward its crescendo. As the final notes shimmered into silence, applause scattered politely through the hall. The Duke did not release her at once. Instead, he studied her face with measured scrutiny, as though confirming a private conclusion. Then, with deliberate calm, he reached into the inner pocket of his coat. A ripple of anticipation passed through those nearest them. From a small velvet case, black as midnight, he withdrew a brooch wrought in the shape of a raven in flight. Its wings were etched in silver so fine they seemed almost feathered, and at its center gleamed a dark stone that caught the chandelier light with a subdued, ominous fire. Eliza's breath faltered. "Your Grace," she began, instinctively stepping back. He did not seek permission. With unhurried precision, he pinned the brooch just below her collarbone, the cold metal grazing the warmth of her skin through silk. "There," he murmured, his voice pitched only for her. "Now they will understand." A collective intake of breath swept the room. In that gesture lay unmistakable implication. A duke did not adorn a woman publicly without intention. The raven, his family crest, rested against her heart. Heat surged to her cheeks, but she forced composure to remain. "You risk more than my reputation with such theatrics." "I do nothing theatrically," he replied. "I act decisively." Across the floor, Charles advanced, color high in his face. Lady Margaret hovered behind him, uncertainty eclipsing her earlier triumph. "This is improper," Charles declared, his voice tight. "Miss Whitcombe is not." The Duke turned his head slightly, and Charles faltered mid-sentence. "Not what?" the Duke inquired, mild as frost. "Not worthy of respect? Not worthy of protection?" A silence fell so complete that the crackle of candle flames seemed audible. Charles swallowed. "She is no concern of yours." The Duke's gaze sharpened imperceptibly. "On the contrary, any lady subjected to public disdain within my sight becomes precisely that." Eliza felt the shift as tangibly as if the air itself had altered density. What had begun as a shield against humiliation was transforming into something more formidable, something edged with challenge. Lady Margaret stepped forward, her composure restored through indignation. "Surely this display cannot imply attachment," she said, her tone sugared and brittle. The Duke's expression did not change. "Implication is the refuge of the timid. I prefer clarity." He extended his hand once more to Eliza. "May I claim the next dance?" Gasps rose again. To request a second waltz in immediate succession bordered on declaration. Eliza's pulse pounded in her ears. She had asked for one dance to salvage dignity. Now she stood adorned with a symbol of allegiance, poised upon the brink of scandal. Yet beneath the scrutiny and whispering, beneath Charles's wounded pride and Lady Margaret's sharpened smile, she felt something steadier than fear. The Duke's presence did not diminish her. It amplified her. "You may," she answered, her voice clear. The orchestra, sensing drama richer than any composition, resumed its strains. As they moved once more into the turning tide of silk and shadow, Eliza understood that retreat was no longer an option. The raven gleamed darkly against her gown, unmistakable. And in the far corner of the ballroom, several matrons exchanged knowing looks, as though already composing the story that would circulate by morning. A story in which Miss Eliza Whitcombe was no longer merely abandoned, but dangerously chosen. The Duke led her out of the ballroom into the terrace beyond, where the warm glow of the gas lamps fell upon frost-laden stone and mist rising like ghostly silk from the garden beds. Winter's breath was sharp against her cheeks, yet she scarcely noticed. The clamor of society, its judgment, its whispers, its expectations, was muffled by the distance and the weight of his presence. Here, away from the glittering eyes and whispering lips, the world contracted to the two of them, and the Duke's gaze held her with an intensity that belied decorum. Eliza adjusted the raven brooch at her collar with a trembling hand. Its dark gleam caught the light, sharp and defiant, and she felt the enormity of its symbolism pressing upon her chest. This was no mere ornament. It was a declaration. The Duke's hand, steady as stone when placed at her back during the dance, now rested lightly at her elbow, guiding her with an authority both protective and commanding. She had expected civility and instead found a reckoning. "You need not have come outside with me," she said, keeping her voice low. "The ballroom suffices for any display you choose to make." His lips curved, almost imperceptibly, but there was no humor there. "The ballroom is for observers. Out here, we speak truth." His eyes, pale and piercing, did not waver. "I find truth far more compelling than pretense." Eliza's heart fluttered at the weight of his words. She wanted to protest, to retreat, to remind herself that this was only a dance, a singular request born of desperation. Yet she could not find the courage to move away. There was a gravity to him, a sense of inevitability, that rendered hesitation impossible. "You have made a spectacle of me," she said finally, her voice a whisper against the wind. "And yet I do not know whether to be grateful or alarmed." "You misunderstand," he replied. "I do not act to astonish society. I act to protect what should not be left exposed." His gaze softened, but only just enough to hint at the depth beneath the surface. "I have witnessed the consequences of neglect, of idle cruelty, and I will not permit it to touch you." The words, spoken with measured restraint, struck her more profoundly than any gesture of comfort could have. Protection, in his hands, was not a shield for weakness. It was a recognition of her strength, an acknowledgement that she could be both vulnerable and formidable. The realization unsettled her as much as it thrilled. She began, searching for the right words. "I did not expect that someone would—" "Expect what?" he asked, turning slightly to meet her gaze. The frost in the air made his breath visible, a ghostly exhale between them. "Kindness? Intervention? Consideration that transcends duty?" "Yes," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "I expected nothing. I was prepared to endure the worst." "And yet you asked for one dance," he said softly, with no trace of judgment. "A singular request, and it brought you into my notice. That notice has consequences. Do you understand?" Eliza nodded, unable to look away. The weight of his stare made her feel exposed, yet she was not ashamed. Not entirely. There was an intimacy in this scrutiny, a recognition that went beyond appearances and polite gestures. He saw her, not as a debutante or a discarded betrothed, but as a woman of resilience, poised beneath the fragile trappings of propriety. The snow began to fall lightly, drifting in silver flakes that clung to her hair and shoulders. The garden seemed suspended between night and dawn, a liminal space where secrets could be confessed without the fear of interruption. The Duke took a step closer, reducing the distance to the barest whisper. "You may return the brooch if you wish," he offered, his tone even, almost ceremonial. "It is not meant to bind you against your will." Eliza's fingers brushed against the cold metal. The gesture was simple, yet charged with meaning. To refuse would be to deny the message it carried. To accept would be to acknowledge its implications. She hesitated, torn between pride and the thrill of surrender. "I cannot," she whispered, meeting his gaze. "It is too deliberate, too potent." He inclined his head, as if satisfied by her answer, and a faint trace of something unspoken, admiration, perhaps, or acknowledgement of courage, passed between them. "Very well," he said, "then it remains with you. Not as a token of ownership, but as a mark that you are seen and defended." Eliza's throat tightened. To be defended, not demanded, was a revelation. Society had always measured her worth in wealth, beauty, and alliances. Yet here was a man who measured it in attention and care, who recognized the quiet dignity she had cultivated against scorn and expectation. Her thoughts were interrupted by movement behind them. A figure emerged from the terrace doors, shadowed and hesitant. Charles. The sight of him shattered the fragile calm. a reminder that the world outside this bubble of frost and light remained relentless. His eyes narrowed at the sight of the brooch, the way she stood, the way the Duke's hand lingered at her elbow. "You," Charles began, but the words faltered in the cold night. The Duke turned slowly, his expression composed yet deadly in its stillness. "Sir," he said, his voice a quiet threat, "you have trespassed upon this space uninvited. Speak cautiously." Charles's mouth opened and closed again. There was a storm in his gaze, but found no purchase. The Duke's reputation, whispered through generations, left no room for doubt. Eliza felt a tremor run through her, not of fear, but of awareness. The presence of her former betrothed highlighted the stark contrast between men of society and the man who stood beside her now. One demanded spectacle and submission. The other offered protection and choice, bound in a silence that spoke louder than any words could. Charles's shoulders stiffened. He took a step forward, only to hesitate. The Duke's hand rested lightly at his sword hilt, a subtle, lethal warning concealed beneath courtesy. Charles faltered and finally withdrew, his retreat measured but ignominious. The tension lingered like smoke, leaving Eliza acutely aware of the power dynamics at play, of the stakes in which her dignity and reputation were quietly defended without fanfare. When the threat dissipated, the Duke released her elbow and stepped back, though not entirely. The space between them remained intimate, charged, as though each breath might carry a declaration unspoken. "You see," he said, voice low and controlled, "it is not always cruelty that endangers a lady. Sometimes it is the absence of intervention." Eliza's chest swelled with conflicting emotions, relief, gratitude, awe, and a fluttering seed of fascination she dared not name. In this cold garden, under the scrutiny of night and snow, she glimpsed a man whose fearsome reputation was tempered by an uncompromising sense of justice, whose gestures, though deliberate and measured, held the weight of sincere regard. She met his gaze, searching for a hint of jest, a trace of irony. There was none, only clarity, only the understanding that her request, a single, desperate dance, had altered the course of the evening, and perhaps far more. The snow continued to fall, each flake a silent witness to the unspoken accord forming between them. Eliza understood that the night had shifted irrevocably. She had entered seeking a shield, yet found instead a reckoning, a promise, and a question whose answer she had yet to discover. And as the Duke's eyes held hers, pale and steady beneath the flickering gaslight, a sound drifted faintly from the ballroom, a reminder that society still waited, that gossip still prowled. But here, in the terrace's icy embrace, she realized that the rules she had known were no longer absolute, and that the man beside her would not permit them to dictate her fate. The quiet threat of dawn seemed suspended in the air, and with it, the first understanding that the night's single dance was only the beginning. The Duke's hand remained at her elbow as they re-entered the ballroom, the warmth and noise of society washing over them like a tide against stone. Candlelight reflected in crystal chandeliers, throwing fractured patterns across the polished floor, illuminating faces painted with astonishment, curiosity, or barely concealed disapproval. Eliza's heart beat in measured rhythm with the orchestra's strings, each note a reminder that she had crossed a threshold from humiliation into defiance, and that every eye in the room would follow her next move. Charles Hardrose's expression had hardened into a mask of disbelief and wounded pride. Lady Margaret clutched her fan so tightly that the ivory ribs creaked, yet her smile was brittle, forced, and unconvincing. The assembled matrons and debutantes paused mid-conversation, whispers faltering into stunned silence. For the first time that evening, Eliza felt the shift in power, not wielded through wealth, nor lineage, but through a man whose reputation alone demanded attention and respect. "You may walk with me," the Duke said quietly, his voice low, controlled, and almost imperceptible to those around them, yet it carried authority that bent the room to him. "Or remain at the edge and endure their scrutiny alone." Eliza lifted her chin, her pride, previously threatened, now mingled with a curiosity she had never permitted herself to entertain. "I shall walk," she replied, steady and deliberate. She did not need to explain, but there was a thrill in asserting her choice. She would not be carried along by circumstance. She would move forward in possession of her own agency. They began a slow waltz, the music swelling like a tide and rolling across the polished floor. Hands brushed lightly, the Duke's touch both guiding and reassuring. Eliza marveled at the precise control with which he led, neither overbearing nor dismissive, but firm in a way that made her feel simultaneously safe and alive. With every pivot, every step, she felt the impossible equilibrium of fear and fascination coiling in her chest. Charles attempted to intervene, stepping closer with rigid formality. "Miss Whitcombe," he called, voice artificially calm, yet threaded with irritation. "Surely this is enough. Your association with the Duke—" His words faltered as he looked for a snare that was not there. "It is unseemly. It invites speculation." The Duke's hand tightened imperceptibly at her elbow, enough to ground her, and he responded without raising his voice. "Speculation is a coward's weapon. Clarity is far more effective." His pale eyes locked on Charles, steady and unyielding. "I intend to court her, sir, and you may choose to observe or withdraw." A collective gasp ran through the onlookers, sharp and audible. To declare intention so openly was not merely bold. It was a rupture in the carefully curated order of society. Every whispered expectation, every subtle hierarchy of alliances shifted in the wake of that statement. Eliza's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of fear and wonder. She had requested a dance to avoid shame, and now she was standing at the center of a declaration that could redefine her life. The orchestra swelled as they turned once more, the Duke's steps measured, commanding attention without effort. Guests leaned forward in anticipation, eyes darting between the pair with a hunger for scandal that society could not disguise. The matronly chaperones whispered behind fans, clearly debating whether to intervene with advice or admonishment. No one dared approach. The Duke's presence created an invisible barrier. Even the boldest tongues stilled in its shadow. "You may speak freely, Miss Whitcombe," he murmured, voice low as they moved in harmony with the music. "I will hear nothing that is unworthy of your character." Eliza lifted her gaze, meeting his without hesitation. "You leave me little choice but to trust you," she said softly, each word deliberate. "This room, this evening, is not kind to those who cannot command attention. And I have, until now, commanded none." His response was near a whisper, though the intensity in his eyes made it feel like a proclamation. "Attention is not commanded, madam. It is earned or taken. You have earned it by enduring, by asking for what you require, even at personal risk. And I take my part in this without hesitation." The waltz continued, every step a testament to the balance of restraint and assertion. As they turned, the Duke produced a small, folded note from his coat pocket, not visible to the gathering eyes around them. He passed it to her with a touch light as a feather. Curiosity flared, and she opened it discreetly, finding a few elegant lines written in his precise hand. "Courage is a rare companion for those treated lightly. Tonight, you have it in abundance. I am at your service, not by duty, but by choice." Eliza's pulse quickened. The note carried weight greater than any public declaration could. It was private affirmation amidst public spectacle, a token of acknowledgement that pierced deeper than any whispered compliment or ornamental gift. She felt her chest rise and fall in rapid succession, heart and mind colliding with the realization that her request for dignity had summoned a protector, a confidant, and perhaps something more, though she did not yet name it. Charles's presence, however, was relentless. He cleared his throat, drawing attention with deliberate annoyance. "Miss Whitcombe," he said, voice now sharper, "you will ruin yourself with association. A duke, he cannot be swayed by sentiment. You are naive to imagine otherwise." The Duke's hand, resting lightly yet deliberately against the curve of her waist, stiffened imperceptibly. Naivete is a dangerous accusation, sir, he replied, voice even but edged with authority. I prefer to act according to principle, not presumption. Charles faltered, words unsaid, and finally stepped back, defeated not by argument but by the mere gravity of presence. The Duke's composure, his calculated gestures, and the silent insistence in his eyes rendered confrontation futile. For once, Eliza understood the depth of his reputation, not as a rumor, but as a lived reality, a shield of consequence and attention that spared no one who dared interfere. The waltz drew to a close, the orchestra's notes fading like a sigh. Yet there was no release, no immediate respite. The ballroom watched, silent and electric, as the Duke offered his arm once more, this time not as a gesture of propriety, but of intent. "Shall we proceed, Miss Whitcombe?" Her fingers brushed against his glove, a tentative affirmation. "Yes, Your Grace," she said, voice steady, though a tremor of exhilaration ran beneath her words. And so they moved, step after step, a silent assertion against the cruelty and expectation that had defined her night. Every pivot, every measured advance, was a lesson in restraint, power, and subtle defiance. The Duke did not merely lead the dance. He redefined it, and through him, she was no longer merely observed. She was elevated. The whispers returned, quieter now, edged with awe and uncertainty. The onlookers sensed a story unfolding that was beyond their ability to command or predict. Matrimonial calculations faltered, alliances paused mid-thought, and even Charles could only watch, powerless, as the young woman he had dismissed became something larger than he could have imagined. The Duke paused at the center of the floor, letting her breathe, letting the moment linger. His eyes searched hers with an intensity that made the room dissolve entirely, leaving only the heat of proximity, the unspoken recognition of courage, and the silent promise that what had begun as a single dance would not end so lightly. And as the first strains of the next set began, he inclined his head, faintly but unmistakably. "You have the choice, Miss Whitcombe. One more dance, or retreat, and leave the consequences to those who misunderstand you." Eliza's chest swelled with a mixture of fear, pride, and anticipation. She understood now that this was no mere engagement of etiquette or fleeting amusement. This was a proposition of intent, a challenge wrapped in civility, and a test of her own resolve. With a measured breath, she lifted her hand, letting her fingers brush his. "Then we shall dance once more," she replied. And in that moment, the room shifted irreversibly. The balance of power altered, the stakes unspoken but profound, and the path ahead illuminated by a courage she had only begun to recognize. The Duke's pale eyes met hers, steady and unwavering, and the raven brooch at her throat caught the light once more, dark and gleaming, a silent herald of the storm, and the promise to come. The ballroom had emptied almost entirely when the Duke led Eliza to a small corner, dimly lit by a single flickering gas lamp, its flame trembling like a heartbeat. The last strains of music lingered faintly through the heavy curtains, carrying with them the scent of wax, perfume, and heated anticipation. Outside, snow had begun to drift more thickly against the tall windows, silvering the city with winter's quiet insistence. For a moment, the world beyond the room seemed irrelevant, a distant echo to the tension coiled between them. Eliza's hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from the weight of the night, the dance, the brooch, the declarations, and a looming presence of the Duke who had reshaped her evening, her sense of dignity, and in ways she dared not yet name, her understanding of desire. She had expected a fleeting rescue, a shield against humiliation, and instead had found herself standing in the orbit of a man who commanded attention not with arrogance, but with deliberate authority, whose every gesture implied not ownership, but protection, and whose eyes now held the promise of a reckoning she could neither ignore nor resist. "You need not answer immediately," the Duke said softly, his voice calm, but suffused with the weight of authority. "I will not coerce you. I offer only choice." Eliza's breath caught. Choice had been a scarce commodity in her life, particularly in the rigid dance of society. The words struck her with unexpected force, a promise that she could speak, that she could act, and that he would respect her decision. Yet the very freedom terrified her, because freedom demanded an answer, and an answer might reshape everything. "You have already done more for me than I expected in a lifetime," she whispered, her gaze dropping to the raven brooch. Its dark gleam caught the lamplight, sharp as truth, and reminded her that every step, every glance, every whispered declaration had carried weight far beyond the ballroom's confines. I scarcely know what to say." "Then speak nothing," he replied, his hand hovering near hers, a breath away but not intrusive. Words are often inadequate. Actions are less so. Eliza's heart quickened. The Duke's measure of actions had already shifted her night from humiliation to defiance, isolation to protection. And yet there remained the shadow of society's judgment, the faint echo of her former betrothed's wounded pride, the invisible web of expectation she had spent years navigating. She understood, in that quiet moment, that to accept the Duke's offer was to step into a world in which scandal and passion, propriety and desire, would intertwine irrevocably. "You could withdraw," he continued, voice barely above the whisper of the gas lamp. "You could leave now, return to the society that observes, and allow me to bear the weight of consequence alone. It is your right. I will not compel you." Eliza looked up, meeting his pale, steady gaze. There was no threat there, only clarity and something deeper, something she had glimpsed in the dance, in the terrace, and in his deliberate gestures, a sincerity that struck her with both exhilaration and fear. He would not command, he would not coerce, he would only stand steadfast until she chose. "I cannot ask you to bear it alone," she said, her voice trembling. "You have already given so much, and I am not accustomed to such generosity." His lips curved faintly, almost imperceptibly, as though acknowledging the truth of her words. Generosity is neither given nor received lightly. It is earned. You have earned it, Miss Whitcombe, simply by being worthy of it. The intensity in his gaze left her breathless. She realized she had never truly been seen before. Not in this way, with such attention to both strength and fragility. Every whispered judgment, every past humiliation, faded in comparison to the acknowledgment in his eyes that she was recognized, valued, and perhaps desired, not for wealth, not for title, but for herself alone. A soft creak drew her attention to the terrace doors, where the last lingering servants moved silently. The city's snow-muffled distant sounds, leaving only the quiet thrum of expectation between them. She took a step closer, and he mirrored her, a rhythm established not by force but by unspoken understanding. "Then if I choose," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "if I choose you." Her words trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of possibility. "Then I shall not falter," he said, voice steady and unwavering. "Nor shall I withdraw. But understand this. To choose me is to enter a life that will not always be gentle. Scandal will follow. Expectation will press. Yet I shall be beside you through all of it." Eliza felt her chest tighten with the enormity of the proposition. To step forward was to risk everything, her reputation, her autonomy, even her heart. Yet the alternative, retreat, felt smaller, colder, and far less alive than the path that stretched before her now. Her hand hovered, trembling slightly, before brushing against his. The warmth of his glove, the firm but gentle strength beneath it, seemed to anchor her courage. "Then I choose," she whispered, her eyes locking with his. "I choose you." A faint smile touched the corners of his mouth, more tender than any display of public favor could convey. He bowed his head, taking her hand in a slow, deliberate gesture, and pressed his lips to the back of it. The kiss was reverent, a seal upon the night's unspoken covenant. It was a promise of protection, of recognition, and of a future neither could yet fully define. The brooch at her throat caught the flickering lamplight, dark and gleaming, a symbol of both their defiance and their accord. Around them, the empty ballroom seemed to hold its breath, the echoes of music and footsteps suspended in the heavy air. Outside, snow fell softly, muffling the city, creating a cocoon of quiet certainty in which nothing else could intrude. "You understand the consequences," the Duke murmured, his forehead brushing against her hand. "The world will not look kindly upon this choice. It may question, it may malign, it may speculate endlessly." "I understand," she replied, her voice steady. "And yet I would rather endure that than live another moment in fear or shame. With you, I feel as though I might stand unbroken." For a long moment, they remained so, their hands entwined, their breaths mingling in the cold air, the snow settling softly around them. The world beyond the terrace existed, but its threats were distant, faint, and inconsequential. Within this fragile, luminous bubble, Eliza felt the first true taste of freedom. Not from circumstance, but from expectation, from judgment, from the weight of being unseen. The Duke finally straightened, releasing her hand only to take both gently in his. "Then let us walk forward together," he said, voice low and deliberate. "Not as master and ward, nor as protector and protected, but as equals navigating a world that has long underestimated both of us." Eliza nodded, a quiet smile brushing her lips. The fear that had once pressed against her ribs gave way to something steadier. Anticipation, courage, and a fragile, luminous hope. As they stepped toward the terrace doors, the snow reflecting the faint lamplight, a shadow moved in the distance, silent, watching, but powerless to intervene. The night had shifted irrevocably. What had begun as a desperate plea for a single dance had transformed into a declaration of intention, a pledge of protection, and the irrevocable choice of hearts daring to defy expectation. And in that moment, with the city quiet beneath the drifting snow and the Duke's steady presence at her side, Eliza understood that the night's trials were not over. Not for society, not for scandal, not for expectation, but that she would no longer face them alone. The promise between them was forged in shadow and light, in whispers and defiance. And as the snow continued to fall, glimmering like silver flame across the terrace, she felt the first true certainty of all. That courage, once claimed, demanded only the next step. And she would take it into whatever storm awaited, with him beside her, unyielding and resolute.